Well, good morning. It's the 2nd of April, and I'm with Karen Wright, taping again from St. Ambrose Church, and we'll move forward today with more of The Right Place, the Right Time, Memoir of a Kentucky Priest, as I am calling this writing project that I've been working on for about a year and a half. Before we start, though, I want to tell you a couple of things. That letters were mailed yesterday from the post office in Cecilia to everybody on our mailing list for St. Ambrose, St. Ignatius, St. Clair. And those letters also include bulletins from last week and this week. It'll have all the information about the prayers and readings for the upcoming Holy Week Masses, and I encourage you to follow those at home. As I say in my cover letter, it's a great time to have a Bible in your home, but quite a bit of information there, and you're going to be able to follow the services not only as we're taping them and posting them to YouTube, but also you're going to be able to follow them in real time. Just about an hour ago, my phone rang, and the voice on the other end said, "Good morning, Father Ben, this is Archbishop Kurtz." And so it was really nice to hear from him. I guess he's calling all the priests and checking on us and comparing notes and so on like that. He says his health and energy are good, and I reported that mine was too. He also, of course, reiterated what was in his letter, and that is that the diocesan website, www.archlou.org, that's ARCHLOU.org, has all information. But the other thing he added to the fact that his services from the cathedral next week will be live streamed. WAVE Channel 3 from Louisville is also going to broadcast some of the Holy Week services. So I would suggest checking local listings for those things. But anyway, we're isolated but not alone, and we're in this together. So we're praying separately but very much together through the wonder of modern technology. Let me say a little bit more about Palm Sunday, because as I also indicate in the letter, ideas come, and change by the hour in this crisis. So I wanted to tell you, excuse me, again, I mentioned it yesterday, the throat clearing is not illness, it's allergy season. And if you hear a raspiness in my voice, it's also the fact that I'm talking so much. When we finished an hour and a half of taping yesterday, I was really gravelly. So anyway, I'll try to not have to do that too often. But I wanted to tell you that a friend of mine who is a 40-plus year employee at the Barton Distillery in Bardstown, a lot of folks in both St. Ambrose, St. Ignatius, and St. Clair will know Charlie Hall, but Charlie called to say that they are beginning to manufacture hand sanitizer. And so anyway, he's going to provide me with 190 proof hand sanitizer. Is that a Kentucky product or what? Anyway, I will use it faithfully, and especially when I am preparing the palm, which I'll do Saturday morning. And then two, for the distribution, and this is what I'd like to suggest, is that as you drive into the parking lot to receive palm, that you keep your windows up. We'll wave, but I'll put the palm underneath your windshield wiper. Again, I'll have hand sanitizer, but I'll also have a mask and gloves and anybody who helps me will be similarly equipped. So if you come for your palm, the letter that you're getting today, or probably tomorrow, tells you come for an hour following the ending of a Mass time. So if you're a Saturday night Mass person, 5:30 Mass usually ends about 6:30. That's when we expect to be distributing palm. If you're an 8 o'clock Mass person, usually ends about 9. That's when we expect to be distributing palm. If you're a 10 o'clock Mass person, it'll end about 11. That's when we expect to be distributing palm. And then, since it's the first Sunday of the month, St. Clare's Mass is at 5:30. When that Mass is finished, we'll begin distributing palm. And we'll do it for an hour or so. So drive into the parking lot, maintain, of course, distances, but also courtesy. We're going to try to develop a one-way flow of traffic. So you come in one way and out the other, and every one of the 3 properties has that capability. Well, back to Right Place, Right Time, Memoir of a Kentucky Priest. Yesterday, I gave you what I consider an overview, 28 pages of a summary of this project. And it serves for me as a bit of an outline. I gave you sort of 10 time periods that I'm using as the structure, at least at this point. I noticed myself, of course I had already noticed, that some of those blocks of time and their descriptions were a little bit fuller than others, but I just found myself, as I wrote that, wanting to use some placeholders, if you will, so that that overview will remind me as I go back through it of some things that I don't want to leave out, some things I want to emphasize, particularly strongly. And again, as you might guess, when I get to this particular segment, which is 2016 forward, the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic will be a topic, because we're doing some things so very differently than we ever have before. Once again, I want to moisten a cloth so that I have it up here and can reach for that as I'm turning pages. And here we go. Again, I'll continually reference the fact that some of this work is being done in conjunction with the coaching I get at Spalding University. And the way that program goes for the Master of Fine Arts in Writing, and also for their new program, the Master of Arts in Professional Writing, is that a person comes to campus for 10 days. It's what they call a residency. The centerpiece of that residency is a 2-hour meeting every day with a group of people who are writing in the same style and genre as you are. Again, mine is creative nonfiction. And so twice now I have gone to Spalding for a 10-day period. Again, 2-hour session each day. Around that, there are various lectures, discussions, other programs, and so that 10-day residency gives a person 3 credit hours, and then they go off and write 5 what are called packets. So a packet is a submission of some of the work that they're working on, and essays on books or movies or things, various types of writings, and each one of those packets goes to a mentor, and that mentor critiques and so on. And those packets tend to go something like 35 to 50 pages. They don't want anything less than 35 and not more than 50. And in the second one of those residencies that I did, the follow-up to that was stretched out over 9 months instead of 5. The other thing about it was that it had more of a requirement of 50 pages, so pretty substantial writing. Now, the first thing that I wrote as a student there, once admitted to the program, was for review. It's what they call a worksheet, because during that 2 hours a day, you are workshopping with other writers. You have read things that they've submitted and critiqued them, and they have done that for yours. To the people that were in my group, I sent this, which is called an excerpt from a planned book-length piece of nonfiction. And it's entitled, as you know now, The Right Place, the Right Time, Memoir of a Kentucky Priest. I have a quote from George Bernard Shaw that introduces it. Of course, he's the great Irish playwright who lived from 1856 to 1950. And this is what he wrote. I am convinced that my life belongs to the whole community. And as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. For the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle for me. It is a sort of splendid torch, which I got hold of for a moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before turning it over to future generations. Now the introduction. In January of 1996, I was spending a leisurely day at China Beach in Vietnam. And in the late afternoon, I decided to go for a swim. In my usual fashion, I swam a sprint of about 100 meters. However, when I stopped, I found I was about 400 meters from the beach. The water seemed unusually choppy, and a small group of children was waving to me from the sand. I dove and splashed and drifted for a few minutes more. Then I saw that I was even farther out, and a few adults were standing with the kids, shouting for me to come in. I didn't know why they were shouting, but I started in. I soon began to remember movie scenes of people calling swimmers from the water, and I began to wonder if my crowd could see something I could not, like a fin. The other element, which began to cause me more concern because it was more real, was that I wasn't closing the distance between myself and the shore, and as I was getting tired, I'd stroke but make little progress. There were some crude single-seat fishing skiffs on the beach, about 150 meters from the group, which had gotten larger and louder, and I thought they might throw me one. Of course, I couldn't communicate that idea to them, not so much because of the language barrier, but because of the noise of the waves. I then knew I was in trouble and could die. In my prayer, I went back to an earlier conversation with the Lord about combat and the readiness to die, which I felt, and said, Lord, I'm not backing down from that position. But is this really what you have in mind? Nobody here knows me very well, and those in Kentucky who do know me well would always wonder about why here and why now. That would make it rather hard on them. They know me to be a strong swimmer. Anyway, Lord, you're in charge. I sensed by this time that I was caught in a rip current, or more likely, an outgoing tide. This is why the water still ebbed and flowed. and why my outbound strokes were so much more efficient than my inbound strokes. I thought of the principles of buoyancy from my scuba diving classes. Less inflation sinks, more inflation floats. Thus, I began to deflate my lungs when the wave was outbound, sinking below and resting my stroke. On the inbound, I would inflate my lungs fully, get on top of the wave, and maximize my stroke. After what seemed a long time, it takes me about 10 minutes to swim 400 meters in a pool, so this was probably about 25 minutes. I got to where I could touch the bottom. Weakened, I was knocked down by the waves a lot, but they knocked me in the right direction. Soon the crowd cheered as I collapsed on a dry patch of the beach where I lay nearly motionless, except for breathing, for another 20 to 30 minutes, as the crowd, except for some of the children, dispersed. I was exhausted but still alive, and through the exhaustion, there came euphoria. Akin, I suppose, to the experience of a runner at the end of a marathon, adrenaline pumping to the max. So I was able, and I needed desperately, to talk. The children who stood near said, "You are from America. Are you Superman?" I said, "No, I'm not Superman." They said, "But we have never seen anyone swim like this." I said, "I'm not Superman. I'm a child of God, and you are too. God, who loves his children, does great things for us." Having escaped death, I am speaking from near exhaustion, words coming in staccato fashion. Really, I can barely talk, but I must. The emotion of being alive, not drowned, and lost produces euphoria. And I must release that energy somehow in spite of exhaustion to someone, even children, even though I must say simple words and phrases. I am human and I must be with other human beings. Life and ordained ministry are for me like a stream, the flow of which is divine sovereignty. The techniques with which we navigate the stream are God-given, but left to us to claim and use to direct ourselves. If we don't, we drift and perhaps drown. If we do, we triumph. The triumph is complete if the crowd disperses, telling the wonders of God's power. The description of this near-drowning episode, which took place when I was 45 years old, was included along with its reflective tagline in a major paper I wrote in a doctoral program. That program was a wonderful opportunity to reflect on the first 50 years of my life, half of which by that time had been spent in ordained ministry as a Catholic priest. Although I had begun military ministry, I had completed but one of what would become 4 tours of duty in the combat zones of Southwest Asia. In that setting, I would find myself in harm's way, but never experiencing such a close brush with imminent death as during that leisurely beach outing. And now, as I enter what are surely my twilight years, when I am more disposed to reflect on life as I have lived it, That moment in 1996 remains pivotal. I want to write a memoir, and one of the main reasons I want to write it is that I am grateful. Grateful to be alive, surely, but grateful for much more. This is to be the memoir of a Kentucky Catholic priest living in the second half of the 20th and the first half of the 21st centuries. It will include my descriptions and reflections on very personal experiences, but also my personal observations and assessments of very public events. In a phrase as simple as Kentucky Catholic priest, there is much which, if unpacked, will reveal major dimensions of the project and even some of its topics and themes. My genealogical roots run deep in the bluegrass state, and from my early formative years, I can trace a consistent hunger for knowledge of its history and culture. With no suggestion that it was unique to my parochial school, I nonetheless look back on the Kentucky Scrapbook Project as the academic highlight of my junior high education. Nowadays, I sleep each night under a quilt of 120 squares, each representing a county of the Commonwealth. The more salient element, though the importance of which will become quickly apparent, is the fact that my ancestors, through the lines of both my father and mother, have lived in Kentucky since before 1800. Of the 4 lines to include my grandparents, the most recent arrivals here were before the Civil War. My Kentucky pride, however, is not the only value I find in these bloodlines. It is what these people brought to Kentucky that has such a bearing on who I am, what I do, and how I do what I do. Faith and the practice of religion have been a significant part of the ethos of the people whose heritage I claim. Serving as a priest, while by no means the only career that appealed to me, was certainly one that had an early attraction. As a boy at a parochial school in the 1950s, I experienced an atmosphere in which the role of a priest in the life of a community was something which held the promise of meaning and fulfillment along with formidable challenge. With contemporary hindsight, we know that much about the priestly role, and certainly elements of its formation and lifestyle, was fraught with problems. Many people, nonetheless, found meaning, indeed heroic lives, by the grace of God manifested in people in response to this calling. When I indicated that the calling was one I discerned, I received considerable encouragement. And the Catholic cocoon, which I experienced with my father's side of the family, had a non-Catholic coloring from my mother's side, the value of which has only become progressively more apparent to me through each decade of my adult professional life. Ecumenism, a concept which for Roman Catholics was largely limited to academic discussion prior to 1965, has now become an accepted, indeed preferred way of life. In spite of my Catholic ghetto mentality, and largely because of my maternal ancestry, I took to the ecumenical movement like a baby duck to water. This became and remains a major element of my personal and professional life and will appear as a prominent thread in the tapestry of this memoir. The Second Vatican Council, often written Vatican II in Roman numerals, the watershed event which brought the most sweeping changes to Roman Catholicism and much more, took place during the years of my secondary education. It was labeled an ecumenical council, and in this memoir it will merit its own chapter. On the personal level, the importance of ecumenism was first expressed for me when I, as a first-year graduate student, served on the founding board of a consortium of 5 seminaries: Louisville Presbyterian, Southern Baptist of Louisville, Lexington Theological, Disciples of Christ, Asbury at Wilmore, Methodist, Wesleyan, Nazarene traditions, and St. Meinrad of Indiana, Catholic, under the title Theological Education of Mid-America, TEAM-A, TMA, clever, huh? The program enabled the cooperation of all the institutions to include the interchange of coursework and campus residency in what is still known as the J, for January, term. Such endeavors are standard today, but this was less than 6 years after the conclusion of the council. Other experiences of ecumenism, such as ministerial associations, joint worship services, etc., would become a way of life from the time I entered ordained ministry. These include a pulpit exchange involving me as a young deacon and the brother of Martin Luther King Jr. However, the context in which I experienced ecumenism professionally over a sustained period was military ministry as a chaplain in the United States Navy. By the way, you're seeing a Coast Guard shirt today. You'll also see a Marine uniform when I read more. But a person who becomes a Navy chaplain, or a physician for that matter, may be called upon to serve all 3 of what we call the sea services, the Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard. So when you saw the shirt this morning, you might have scratched your head and thought, I thought he was in the Navy. Well, it was Navy, but I served with the Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard. And that's where I really experienced ecumenism, the topic I'm reading about now. One of the first lessons a chaplain candidate receives is that ministry will be to and with people whose faith traditions differ from one's own. My introductory speech to each new unit usually went like this. Statistics indicate that as a Roman Catholic, I share the same denominational tradition with about 35% of the unit. However, I am chaplain to 100% of you. So keep in mind that this ministry is offered to people of all faiths and no faith. Life in the military will be another major theme of this memoir, both from my experience as a participant in the war protests of the 1960s and 70s, as well as from my experience as an officer in the uniformed services. It is in the latter context that I will write much about the experiences of religious ritual and sacramental worship. This too will encompass a radical change in my experience as a Roman Catholic prior to and since the 4th of December of 1963. This is the date on which was promulgated the truly historic dogmatic constitution on the sacred liturgy. Had the changes wrought by this teaching not taken place, it is doubtful that I would have become a priest or remained a Catholic. And my opposition to the conservative backlash in Catholic worship, which has emerged in very recent years, threatening the reforms of Vatican II, will become not only a theme in this writing, but one of its principal purposes. To the frequently asked question of why I wanted to become a priest, I give naturally a fairly thorough and discerning response. However, a central element is in the simple answer, I became a priest because I wanted to help people have a meaningful and relevant experience of religion and worship. At the core of that ministry is my conviction that ritual does not make the experience of faith happen. Ritual happens as an expression of the experience of faith. This represents in a much too succinct way the shift in how Catholics perceived worship before Vatican II and after Vatican II. The Committee on the Liturgy of the National, that is, American Conference of Catholic Bishops, famously expressed this notion in a much-quoted document considered a follow-up to the dogmatic constitution referred to above. Their quote, "Faith grows when it is expressed in celebration. Good celebrations foster and nourish faith. Poor celebrations weaken and destroy it." End quote. If I seem to be making a big deal of this issue of historic change in the understanding of Catholic ritual, it is intentional. It is and has been an essential element of not only what I do and how I do it, but also of who I am. And the change that has taken place in the last 50 plus years is more significant than any in the previous 500 years. And yet, this is but one change which will have characterized my lifetime on this planet. There are many and significant others about which I continually reflect and about which I will write. Certainly, every age has experienced its changes, and any student of history would be hard-pressed to present a hierarchy of importance of one over the other. At the turn of the millennium, many attempted to publish lists of most important people, events, inventions, and the like. They make for great discussion, but can hardly be definitive. Even when we consider empirical data, such as the change in life expectancy over the decades, it can be helpful information, but precision is elusive. I'm personally intrigued by, for example, the assessment of life expectancy at birth for men in America in the 20th century, as presented in a University of California, Berkeley study published earlier this year. In 1900, the measure was 46 years and 3 months. 1950, 55 years and 6 months. In 2000, it was 76 years and 6 months. In the first half of the century, the span grew by 9 years and 3 months, but in the second half, that amount more than doubled. More recent studies put the life expectancy at 78 years and 8 months. And though that statistic may suggest that the pace has perhaps slowed in the first decade and a half of the 21st century, a related statistic is similarly interesting. Today, 2016, I'm writing this. This is a quote. Today, people 80 and older are the fastest growing age group in the United States. There are more people 100 and older, called supercentenarians, living healthy and enjoyable lives than ever before. This is from Jane Thibault, PhD, Professor Emerita of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Louisville. I cite these statistics to suggest that while this calibration might be able to be done with some degree of efficacy, even that cannot be achieved with other cultural shifts and changes of my lifetime about which I want to reflect and write. I can't help but pause there and speculate the crisis that we're in now, which seems likely to perdure for several months into the future, will affect the statistics that I just gave, or at least will color them for this second decade. I guess we're in the third decade of the 21st century. But it also causes me to tell a story that that's not in here yet, but which will perhaps get in here. And it has to do with one of the oldest people in the state of Kentucky. And I'm thinking of a woman, a sister, at St. Catherine Convent, Springfield. And maybe I shouldn't name names, but it is a pretty wonderful episode to tell about, and I've told it publicly more than once. But anyway, this sister has now had her 108th birthday. And I must confess, I'm not sure what the date is. She may be 109 now. And as far as I know, she's still alive. But within the last year or so, I was at St. Catherine. I'm there frequently. And a sister who's closer to my age was chatting with me, and as we watched, the super centenarian sister came walking down the aisle on her walker. And my contemporary said, "Oh, there goes that sister. She really makes me mad." She said it in more colorful language than that. But I said, "What? How can you say she makes you mad? What do you mean?" She said, "Yeah, she really makes me mad." And I said, "Oh, come on. She's a picture of piety, and God has surely blessed her living all these years. What can be about her that makes you mad?" And the sister I was chatting with said, "Because she can genuflect and I can't." I grew up in the west end of Louisville. Along with many another teenager, I cheered wildly as I watched black and white television or listened on AM radio to the broadcast of the young man just 5 years my senior, winning the Olympic boxing championship in Rome. However, when Muhammad Ali, then Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., came back to the neighborhood, he was not allowed to go to the same movie theaters, restaurants, and amusement parks that I was. Even today, if one moves west to east on streets such as River Park Drive, the name will change at 31st Street, going north-south, to Chestnut Street. This marked the line between the neighborhoods wherein black citizens were allowed to reside and where white people resided. The situation changed with the adoption of the Fair Housing Act, which was a component of the Kentucky Civil Rights Act of 1968. As a seminary student, I participated in public demonstrations toward this and other goals of the civil rights movement. Today, with the proliferation of police shootings and other brutal treatment toward people of color, it seems at times that the efforts of the 1960s and 70s were in vain. They were not. They did bring about change. I want in this memoir to reflect on that change and write my observations of those experiences. Also in that momentous year, which still seems incredible after more than half a century, I campaigned for Senator Robert Kennedy as he won the Democratic presidential primary in Indiana. President Lyndon Johnson had announced that he would, quote, "neither seek nor accept the nomination," unquote. And of those who were vying for the position, Senator Kennedy seemed to me to have the best approach to the two most pressing issues of the day: civil rights and an end to American military involvement in Southeast Asia. The previous year, I had won an undergraduate oratorical contest with a speech supporting the rationale for the war effort. Things had changed, though, and would continue to. By 1972, two of my brothers had fought in Vietnam, one for his second tour of duty, However, on the 20th of January in Washington, D.C., I was a demonstrator at the inauguration of Richard Nixon's second term as president. Therein may be found perhaps the most ironic feature of this memoir. I protested the military and I served in the military. Again, we sense the theme of change. In 1958, a sister 10 years my senior became pregnant, quote, without the benefit of marriage, unquote, to resurrect a phrase common in the era. If she had been married, the expression would have been something like, in a family way. This reminiscence is especially loaded with material for reflection on the theme of change. Taboos and mores around the human experience of sexuality and genitality may be, with the exception of health and medicine, the arena which has seen the most dramatic change in my lifetime. As I describe the generation that preceded me, especially on the Roman Catholic side, I will offer some insight and opinion on the development of sexual morality in the context of pioneer living. To return, though, to the experience of my dear sister, an experience which was, by all accounts, a poignant mixture of joy and tragedy, I want to note a few things from the general culture of the day and some from the familial experience. Conversations about sex, reproduction, the human anatomy, and so on simply did not happen in public. It was considered a sociological breakthrough in acceptability when Lucille Ball and later Mary Tyler Moore appeared in television acting roles while pregnant. Becoming pregnant before marriage was considered not only sinful, but a family crisis of major proportions. It was not unusual for a young woman to suddenly go away for a while, typically to live with a relative at considerable distance, to return a year or so later having given a child up for adoption. This happily did not occur with either of my sisters who married after pregnancy, one in the 1950s and the other in the 1970s. But attitudes changed radically between those two events, and of course even more radically since. In the 1980s, I was in conversation, excuse me, let me start that sentence again. In the 1980s, I was in conversation with a senior priest along the lines of this topic of taboo versus acceptability. He was 35 years ahead of me, both in age and ministry experience. I remember making the statement that I had not heard the words homosexual and heterosexual in a formal setting until I was a senior in high school in 1964-65. He said, "Ben, I was ordained 10 years before I ever heard them," and that was 1949. The topic of psychosexual development in the seminary, along with the theological and other issues around the topic of mandatory celibacy, will be explored in this memoir. Confiding my experience of and response to the abuse crisis, which in my denomination continues to cause anguish, will be something from which I cannot shrink if this memoir is to have validity for me or credibility, even interest for potential readers. Who will those readers be? For whom will I write this memoir? Will anyone want to read it? Whether or not it is ever read, I want to write it. So the answer to those questions, as we once joked, is me, myself, and I. Tradition has it that Socrates, during his trial in Athens in the 4th century before the Common Era, uttered this dictum, quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living," unquote. though he was subsequently convicted of, quote, impiety and the corruption of youth, unquote, and sentenced to death, the words of Socrates, I believe, are words to live by. I want to reflect on life as I have experienced it, and in that experience I have found that I reflect best when I write. Several times in recent years I have received unsolicited encouragement to write. When I began to listen to those remarks, it occurred to me that a memoir would probably be the easiest type of writing for me to do. I think I might have some skill for writing dialogue, but feel fairly certain that I like the creativity for plays or novels or poetry. It is about a year now since I became intentional about this memoir, closer to 2 really. And I have spoken to others about it. I appreciate the encouragement I'm receiving, especially from the congregations that are hearing this and have heard me talk about it now for many months. But what is proving to be most helpful are questions such as this. Why would I, this is a question coming to me, people will say, why would I, as a non-Catholic, a non-priest, a non-Kentuckian, want to read this? What's in it for me? What do you have to tell me? Of people who are my age and who have known me professionally or personally, some have asked, what if this is the Archbishop again? No, it's not. Sorry. Let's see. I was saying that of people who are my age and who have known me professionally or personally, some have asked and more have wondered why I went into the ministry and why I have stayed, in what ways I have found fulfillment, what strategies I have used for coping with frustration. Others who are my age but have not known me might share my penchant for reminiscing and might enjoy looking back on years of parallel experiences. When I recently participated in a graduate study program with students whose average age was 30 years my junior, they were either very courteous or genuinely interested in hearing firsthand descriptions of events, personalities, movements, cultural changes, etc., such as those referenced above, which reflect values that they take for granted or only absorb from historical record. They might be interested in reading this book. What I was referring to there was in 2014 to 2016, I went to Bellarmine and took some classes there, and they were with people, many, if not most of them, were less than half my age, and they, when I would tell them things like, living in the same neighborhood as Ali, or the civil rights movement, or protesting the war in Vietnam on college campuses and stuff like that, they really seemed to tune in. But like I said, they might have just been very courteous people. And we're getting down, just a few more pages. It will soon be 9 years since I came home from military service. It will soon be 11 years since I came home from military service. Since that time, I have consistently been in consultation with medical and behavioral health specialists. A recurring theme of that dialogue has been my expression of concern and even anxiety about avoiding the late career crash and burn syndrome. I wrote an article about priests who have ended their careers in addiction, in ignominy, in jail, in suicide. There would be danger in thinking myself immune to those scenarios. Writing a memoir is a way of being productive and avoiding problems. And if the problems come, there is some record of the time and happiness before they came. It is my experience that priests are always remembered to some extent, for better or for worse. Perhaps it's the simple fact that what we do is so very public. In a routine Sunday service, we are in the center of attention for dozens, if not hundreds, of spectators. Our appointments and residencies are published on social media networks as well as in the print and broadcast media. And in the personal moments, especially sacramental ones such as christenings, weddings, counseling, last rites, burials, etc., strong bonds are created along with vivid memories. So when I learn of a priest who has crashed and burned, no matter whether it is through his own fault, illness, or whatever the cause, I pray not only for those he may have hurt, however heinously, but also for those he may have helped, even a little. Two of the most famous Catholics with whom I shared the planet in the 20th century were the Kentucky monk Thomas Merton and the sainted Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I met both of them. Volumes have been written by and about them. However, it seems to me at least that the most revealing words about them have been published posthumously. I'm thinking of Come Be My Light, the private writings of the Saint of Calcutta, and the Asian Journal of Thomas Merton, published in the year of his death, and more revealing, the 7 volumes of his journals edited by his secretary, Brother Patrick Hart, of the Trappist Monastery at Gethsemane, who just died a few months ago, and published these 7 volumes of Merton's journals were published at Merton's direction not until 25 years after his death. My fond hope is to complete this writing and publish, or at least preserve it, before my death. I continue to reflect on and try to articulate reasons for writing. I also want to respond to why write now. My age is one of the obvious reasons. There is more to remember when one is older. I want to be honest, even transparent and candid. That may be easier to do as a senior priest than it might have been earlier. These observations and analyses will be personal to me. I do not plan to ask for or receive the imprimatur, or approval, of my ecclesiastical or military superiors. Another question to muse about this memoir is, how will I write it? It will be in part with composition skills such as they have been developed through academic training and use over the years. One of these uses has been the practice of sending group letters to family and friends, at times quarterly, at times monthly, with seasonal regularity, and so on. The number of these and other correspondence is likely about 300. Because I still have them, they will be a helpful resource for people, places, dates, etc. People are always telling me that I have a good memory. Well, I also look things up. And I'll have clerical help from friends. In fact, this is a good place to mention Virginia Hart and Denise Vaught, both members of St. Ambrose, who have typed most of what I'm reading now. I would not do this, could not do this without them. If it weren't for them, this would all be in longhand. Something else which is a key component of my life and identity is music. I will use it in this writing. I appreciate music in most, if not all, forms. I didn't think I liked rap until I heard the soundtrack following with the libretto in my hands for Hamilton. And then I got to see it at the theater. Piece of genius. I participate in a choral ensemble which performs a minimum of 8 concerts a year, for which we have 30 rehearsals. Not doing any rehearsals right now for Mid-Kentucky Chorus. Music has always been a key element of worship, both before and since the liturgical changes of the 1960s. The music of the movement, civil rights, anti-war, etc., serve not only to rally us, but to be our conscience. Here's an example which had and continues to have a powerful effect on me. You'll find this on YouTube, probably under Peter, Paul, and Mary. It's called The Great Mandala. And the lyrics go like this. So I told him that he'd better shut his mouth and do his job like a man. And he answered, listen, Father, I will never kill another. He thinks he's better than his brother that died. What the hell does he think he's doing to his father who brought him up right? And the refrain, take your place on the great mandala as it moves through your brief moment of time. Win or lose now, you must choose now. And if you lose, you're only losing your life. Second verse. Tell the jailer not to bother with his meal of bread and water today. He's fasting till the killing's over. He's a martyr. He thinks he's a prophet, but he's a coward. He's just playing a game. He can't do it. He can't change it. It's been going on for 10,000 years. Take your place on the great mandala as it moves through your brief moment of time. Win or lose now, you must choose now. And if you lose, you're only losing your life. Third verse. Tell the people they are safe now. Hunger stopped him. He lies still in his cell. Death has gagged his accusations. We're free now. We can kill now. We can hate now. Now we can end the world. We're not guilty. He was crazy. And it's been going on for 10,000 years. Take your place on the great mandala as it moves through your brief moment of time. Win or lose now, you must choose now, and if you lose, you're only losing your life. This song, as I mentioned a minute ago, was a response from Peter, Paul, and Mary with Al Grossman, their producer, to the individual protesters in many movements during my formative years. It reflected what we called the generation gap, something which I experienced intensely with my father. I will be writing about his emotional investment in my calling as a seminary student and priest. Little else that I did seemed to please him. He was once heard to remark, if Ben were not in the seminary, he would just be one more nigger-loving hippie, unquote. I have carefully avoided referring to this as my memoir. In a similar way, I do not refer to my ministry, my priesthood, even my anniversary. Like all of life, these things are not experienced in isolation. I'm the result of many elements coming together, and all that I believe and do involves many others. I was provided with this truly life-changing insight by a man junior to me in seminary, actually an advisee who later became a priest, Reverend Joseph Vest, whose physical health was never robust, served with great courage and effectiveness, but died in 2004, less than 25 years into the ministry. Among his efforts, however, was the public support of the Fairness Campaign for LGBT rights, which began in Metro Louisville in 1991. His time among us, all too brief, will be referenced in this memoir, the title of which I have only mentioned in part, Kentucky Priest. The right place at the right time, the other portion of the title, also merits some comment before I bring this introduction to a conclusion. After the completion of a particularly intense period of my life over the months, weeks, and days of the 27th of June, 2004 to the 11th of February of 2005, I was honored before a large group of people when they were told that I possessed a knack for being in the right place at the right time. This period of time was a tour of combat duty in Babil Province, central Iraq, during the post-9/11 global war on terrorism, with an expeditionary Marine unit in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Standard procedure following a deployment of this kind is the change of command for many in leadership positions at various levels in these military elements. My immediate supervisor prior to, during, and for a time after the deployment was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Durkin, USMC. He is a man who fits the stereotypical profile of a Marine officer in that he keeps emotions in check, compliments subordinates sincerely but succinctly, and uses words sparingly in most settings, especially in public speaking. At a change of command ceremony, standard operating procedure is for the officer assuming command to read his orders and receive the symbolic guidon or unit colors without much in the way of speaking part in the ceremony. The officer who is relinquishing command is the real star of the moment. He is typically feted with a complimentary speech outlining the unit's accomplishments under his watch and is regularly awarded a medal for that mission accomplished. The presiding senior officer, typically a general, then invites this unit commander to speak. It was at this particular moment that Lieutenant Colonel Durkin expressed gratitude to various members of his staff and spoke of challenging moments during the deployment and said, because of the shortage of Catholic chaplains, our priest was often on mission at a distance from our headquarters. But whenever there was a crisis, bad news from home, injury or fatality to one of our Marines, etc., whenever I needed the chaplain, I would look up and Father Brown would be standing there, kind of the Radar O'Reilly of our battalion landing team. Later on, in another ceremony, the same presiding general, due largely to Lieutenant Colonel Durkin's effort on my behalf, presented to me the Bronze Star for meritorious service in the theater of combat operations. When he invited me to speak, I was uncharacteristically succinct, saying, "Thank you, General. I guess this is about being at the right place at the right time." That expression applies to many more private moments in military experience. It also applies to other dimensions of this life upon which I'm reflecting. I have mentioned some of the moments and some of the movements. There are certainly more. I am very grateful that it has been my good fortune to have been born when I was born and lived when I have lived. Would you have liked to have lived in another time, place, and culture? Maybe a conversation starter for a cocktail or dinner party. For my part, though, there's plenty about which to reflect and write from the years, locations, opportunities, relationships of the lifetime I have been given. I have found, too, that aspects of this professional journey, such as parish ministry, counseling ministry, youth ministry, educational ministry, and the like, have been my subspecialty at the right time and place. I found myself suited to or capable of adjusting to the mission that I've been directed to pursue. One of the major dynamics therein has been the God-given ability to interact genuinely with people, to meet them where they are, to cherish their acceptance of me, to reverence them as fellow travelers on this journey. This morning, the 24th of September of 2018, I awoke, as I do most mornings, to the broadcast news from the local affiliate of National Public Radio. Reporter Lynn Neary was describing a vocal performance which took place on the Washington, D.C. Mall during the March for Our Lives earlier this year. Academy Award-winning actress and singer Jennifer Hudson was soloist in a choral performance with a group of high school and college students from Columbia, Maryland. They were singing "The Times They Are A-Changing," which Bob Dylan wrote in 1963 when I was a high school junior. Lynn Neary was 13. It was 18 years before Jennifer Hudson was born. Bob Dylan is now 79 years of age. Ms. Neary spoke eloquently about what the timeless protest anthem meant to her. It continues to stir my soul. Perhaps the constant about change is that because it is continuous, people who engage with it can be in the right place at the right time. The end for today. And those of you who heard the taping from yesterday, where I read the overview, saw some overlapping there, some things that you heard almost word for word from yesterday's were in today's. So that, I think, is a wrap. Again, keep in mind my comments for this weekend. And watch, if you're a member of St. Ambrose and St. Ignatius, St. Clair, watch for your letter in the mail probably tomorrow or Saturday. And everybody have a good Holy Week. As I say in my letter, I can't think of a year when we needed Holy Week more. And we will be, of course, celebrating the promise of Jesus that we would carry crosses, but he would carry his first. And as we watch him carry his, he's watching us carry ours. And as we're hearing so often and so profoundly, we're all in this together.